자, 그러면 let's start the lecture. Prejudice. No, you cannot touch my hair. So this transcript, this lecture was about a girl named Mina who had lots of trouble growing up as a black woman. So she starts her first sentence by saying, I launched the No You Cannot Touch My Hair campaign survey. So she did a campaign. And it was about, what was it about? Unwanted and uninvited hair touching. So a lot of the times, black people are said to have their hair been touched by other people, and they do not like it. It has a negative effect on them. So she wanted to do a survey. She wanted to do a campaign to prevent it. So this campaign was about to prevent what? Unwanted and uninvited touching. 자, 이번 캠페인은 무엇을 위해 시작됐다? 흑인들이 자신이 원치 않는데도 머리를 만지는 행위를 멈추기 위해서, prevent, 방지하기 위해서 시작이 됐습니다. And here it says some people genuinely didn't know. Some people, 몇몇 사람들은 genuinely, 진짜로 몰랐다고 합니다. So she thought she needed to tell people about the trouble of hair touching. So she started a little social experiment. Now let's go over the next page and look at it together. Now let's move on to the next part. So in the next part, before she starts explaining about the experiment, she shows a little video of unwanted hair touching. And she asked the respondents how they felt. And most people said they felt really weird and they felt uncomfortable. And also, two important keywords. They felt intrusive and it felt invasive. So when you say intrusive or invasive, it means they felt that they had lack of personal space. They had lack of privacy. So it felt very rude to them. Also, most people were very angry and annoyed. Also, another thing she found from the experiment was that, let's look at this sentence together. The majority of those were black women and girls. So she found out the victims of hair touching were usually what? Black women and girls. So in the last sentence, she says this campaign is really targeted. It's to help who? The overwhelming, the too much, disproportionate, unbalanced number of black people. So too many black people, especially black women, that experience unwanted hair touching. So let's summarize this part together. So after the experiment, most people had the feeling of being very angry and being very intrusive, invasive. And most people realize that this experiment usually happens to black women. 자, 그래서 이 활동으로, 이 경험으로, 실험으로 무엇을 알게 됐냐? 대부분 사람들이 이 머리를 만지는 거에 대해서 굉장히 부정적으로, 굉장히 거슬린다고 반응을 했으면 이러한 머리 만짐이 주로 누구에게 나타난다고? 주로 흑인에게 나타난다는 것을 새롭게 알게 되었다고 지금 얘기를 하고 있습니다. Now that I explained, you can go and fill the summary table or you can continue listening and fill the summary table at the end. Now I will move on to the next page. Now let's move on to the next part. In the next part, she shares her experience of when she was young. So, at age 7, the difference started. So I started to notice that I was different from my peers. And the crazy question started, why are you black? So people started to notice that she was different. And people started asking questions. And this is a very important statement. I never considered why they were born white. So usually, whiteness is considered the norm, the normal, whereas someone's blackness is considered different, is considered unique. So people started to notice that she was black and it was considered very different from other people. So in response to people asking questions, what did she do? She started making up stories. She made up fake stories of why she was black. And at that time, she felt that she was very intelligent. She was superior to other people because she thought that she could manipulate, she could persuade other people why she was black with her own story. So now let's move on to the next page together. So at age 7, she was able to make up all different stories, but by the age of 9, my difference started to become more of an embarrassment. So emotions have begun to change. And this is what happens to her. I was more developed than my peers. So we get into showers and my peers were fascinated by my body. So they realized how black body was very different from their own body. So much so that they took in turns in the shower and grabbed me here and there. So when you say fascination, it usually have a positive meaning to it. Whereas grabbing someone's body usually it's very negative. So even though they were fascinated, they had good motivation, the action of grabbing her without telling her about it had very negative impact on her because afterwards she felt very humiliated. She was very embarrassed. So she decided to deal with it by being mute. Mute means being quiet, not talking. So if we look closely into the two stories together, at first, when she realized that she was different, how did she respond to that? She made up stories. And from making up stories, she felt very intelligent. But as she grew up, people's fascination with her hair or her body grew. And she became more embarrassed about that she became mute. She did not talk as much and she felt very humiliated. So these experiences impacted her very negatively. 자, 그러면요. 이 미나에게는 두 가지 일이 있었는데요. 어렸을 때는 그녀가 달랐다는 것을 인지했을 때 그녀가 어떻게 대응했어요? 그녀가 그냥 새로운 이야기를 막 만들어내서 아, 내가 이렇게 똑똑한 사람이구나. 내가 다른 친구들보다 훨씬 훌륭한 사람이라서 이렇게 재밌는 이야기도 만들어낼 수 있구나 라는 긍정적인 느낌을 받았다면 그녀가 다르다는 게 더 심해져서 사람들이 어땠어요? Fascination, 굉장히 그녀에 대해서 호기심이 더 많이 생기게 된 거예요. 그녀에 대해 호기심이 더 많이 생기니까 어때요? 계속해서 질문을 한다거나 그녀를 만져보거나 하는 그런 무례한 행동들이 조금씩 더 시작이 됩니다. 그래서 그녀가 이거에 대해서는 어떻게 반응을 했어요? 그냥 더 이상 말을 하지 않기로 결심을 했어요. 그리고 그녀는 어떤 감정을 더 많이 느끼게 됐다? Humiliation. 더 민망하고 더 창피하고 더 그런 부끄러움을 훨씬 더 많이 느끼게 되었다는 좀 슬픈 그런 경험을 공유를 하고 있습니다. Now, let's look at the last part together. So, what she wants to say from her experience is that if we appreciate the difference, we wouldn't be seen as so much of another. So, now let's move on to the next part. The next part talks about the history of Black people's exploitation. So in the paragraph before this, she talks about her own experience of having a hard time being very different from other people because she was Black. And now she moves on to talking about how in the past the Black people had been treated a lot worse than what is now. So the first example is a woman named called Saartjie Baartman. So this lady named Baartman, and this was back in 1810, she had very distinct features. Her body shape looked very different. So what did people do with her? They put her in display. Why? Because people were fascinated, people were intrigued, people were curious about her body. So these words, once again, they all have very positive meaning to it. So why did I put her in display? Maybe it had good positive intention because people were curious, people were fascinated, people wanted to know about her body. But putting someone in display is never a good action. It was a very negative action. So she relates this history with her hair touching. Because she says here, I have to say that the actions keep repeating themselves. And here she says a very important statement that the fascination with Black bodies, and I include Black hair, has been around for centuries. The reason why people are fascinated by it is because they believe that it is very different from them. And the second example was about human zoos. This human zoos consists of African tribes. In these African tribes, people would come to stare and see. So they would point, they would stare, and they would view. Why? Because, once again, they were very fascinated by them. So in the past, it was very obvious that the Black people were not treated equally. They were not ever treated equally, but they were viewed as something very different. They were viewed as more of an object that were very interesting to look at. 자, 그러면요. 잠깐만 한국말로 한번 설명을 해보자면, 자, 지금 여기서 이 문단에서 이제 흑인들이 어떻게 착취를 당했는지에 대한 역사를 설명하고 있는 거죠. 자, 첫 번째 예시 바트맨은요. 그녀가 어떻게 됐다고 했어요. 그녀가 이제 박물관에 전시가 되는 현상이 있었습니다. 왜? 사람들이 이 사람을 싫어서가 아니에요. 너무 신기하다는 이유로, 너무 우리와 다르다는 이유가 너무 신기해서, 너무 호기심을 불러일으켜서 이런 굉장한 행동을 했다라고 얘기를 합니다. 두 번째, Human Zoos. 두 번째, 이제 인간 동물원이 만들어졌는데요. 이 인간 동물원은요, 아프리카에서 데려온 사람들을 가지고 사람들에게 굉장히 큰 호기심을 불러일으켰어요. 자, 다음 페이지 넘어가 볼게요. 자, 아직 같은 paragraph입니다. So in the first sentence, she says that many women who responded to the survey said that people touching their hair, it felt like being petted in a zoo. So long time ago, there was human zoo and people thought this was racism, but still hair touching happens, which feels like people are in a zoo. So she says a very important statement at the end. She says, is the motivation different? Because the actions still are same. Because why? Human zoo in the past is basically like touching a Black person's hair without telling them about it. So what does she want to say by sharing her own experience and talking about the history of Black exploitation? She wants to say that even if the motivation is innocent or harmless, the actions will still affect the black people? How? Very negatively. So it's very important for us to realize and be aware that looking at other people differently can bring a very negative action, even if the motivation isn't harmless. So the fascination with black body, fascination with black people can never be what? Justified. Because the action itself is wrong. So this was what her intention of sharing her story. She wanted to tell people that just looking at a black person differently and acting on it can never be justified, even if the motivation is not harmless. Now we're going to move on to the last paragraph together, which has some very important keywords. In the last paragraph, she starts by saying that the world is systematically unequal. So what is unequal about our world? In this world, recently there has been new words created. Unconscious bias. So unconscious bias means having prejudice without knowing. What about microaggression and macroaggression? So when you say aggression, it means attack. Micro means very small. Macro means very big. So when you say microaggression, it means having bad opinion about the other person, but not staying it fully. What about macroaggression? Being very straightforward up about the aggression itself. So these new terms have been created recently, but she says, I would argue that we should really be saying racism. Racism, what is racism? Being prejudiced towards a certain race. And here she says a very important message, and she shows a very strong image of what racism is. So if power and prejudice is combined together, it creates racism. And if racism is put together with ignorance, not being aware of other things, it creates microaggression. So when you say you are being microaggression, you are being microaggressed, it means not being aware of what's wrong in the society, such as touching a black person's hair without thinking that it would offend the other person. So this is a very important word here, because microaggression, such a small action such as touching another person's hair without their permission, can be seen as a racism. 자, 이 부분을 조금만 한국말로 더 설명을 해볼게요. 자, 먼저 우리는요, unconscious bias라는 이제 표현을 쓰게 됩니다. 무의식적 편견이란 뜻이고요. 자, microaggression, macroaggression 이 표현들은 이제 사전에는 잘 나오지 않는데 결국 무슨 말이냐? 혐오인데요. 이 혐오가 강한 혐오이냐? 아니면 굉장히 교묘한 혐오이냐? 대놓고 혐오를 하느냐? 아주 교묘하게 뒤에서 혐오를 하느냐? 뒤에서 차별을 하느냐? 라는 단어의 의미입니다. 자, 그래서 만약에 권위와 편견이 같이 만나게 된다면 이것은 바로 인종차별을 만들어내는 거고요. 인종차별이 무엇과 합쳐지면? 무지함과 합쳐지면 이것이 바로 교묘한 혐오, 교묘한 차별을 만들어낸답니다. 그래서 우리가 이렇게 교묘하게 차별을 하게 되면 우리는 사실 잘못된 행동을, 사회적으로 잘못된 행동임에도 불구하고 그거를 충분히 인지하지 못한다는 아주 큰 문제를 일으키게 된다는 것을 지금 여기서 강조하고 있습니다. 자, 다음 문단 한번 같이 보도록 할게요. 자, 그럼 마지막 문단 한번 같이 볼게요. So she wants to say that such innocent hair touching should not be innocent because it is a micro aggression. It says we don't have systems in place to stop it, so she wants to call them hair attacks. These are attacks on her. And she claims the right to be treated how? Equally. She does not want to be treated any differently. She also wants to be treated equally. So how can we do this? What can we do? What can be done to look at Black people as an equal human being? The first idea she says is that the people just need to stop touching. So it's very important to never blame the victim. Second thing, she says we need better education. We need better awareness. The last thing she says, if this is new to you, then learn and share. So sharing with other person what you should do and how you should act towards people who are different is also very important. So from this entire story, I believe that what she wants to say is we always have to be aware of my actions and the little things I do to a person just because they are different. It's very important for us to accept, respect, and appreciate the difference. So what she wants to say about hair touching is that instead of noticing how Black people are very different, how they have very different hair from us, it's very important for us to respect, appreciate the differences they have from us. And I think that's the most important lesson that she wanted to give from this lecture. So for the next class, I want you guys to think about what are some prejudice or what are some actions you thought that it would be considered a microaggression. What are some prejudice? What are some bias? What are some actions that we need to change in our society? It doesn't necessarily have to be about race. It can be about sex. It can be about sexism. It can be about class. It can be about age. It can be about appearance. So in your next class, think about any prejudice, any bias you had to face regarding these issues. This is the end of my lesson, and I will see you next class.